what I thought I'd do is open the conversation up really with some nostalgic scenes of what life was like before lockdown, using some of the case studies from the book that Romy mentioned I just published with Burkhauser. And if you want to follow along on Twitter, Instagram, or use the internet, please do pick up those links in the bottom of the screen. So really, the interest in the subject of the book, this idea of flexible public spaces that are programmed and activated, really started with this space outside the National Theatre on the South Bank in London, which is a relatively simple design space. And what's interesting, obviously, is what's happening behind the scenes, the efforts that people are doing to roll out a collection of different installations and performances that really transforms this place on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis and demonstrates really the richness of those spaces. At the same moment, I was cycling through London and seeing just the quotidian rhythms of a city where you have empty lawns like this that at lunchtime in a dense built-up city that's largely hard space, you see just get filled to capacity with people at lunch. At the same time, there's moments like this where you have framed containers that the contents are inserted with different community events or more planned activities like bringing sand in that pulls the community together. And wouldn't it be amazing again to see people being able to dance in public space like we see in this image in the center. And it really prompted me as I got deeper into this subject matter of where I had come from with my own education and perhaps what the zeitgeist at the time was. And this was obviously, this is from the 70s, but through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this was really the aesthetic and the design intent of many leading practitioners, the work of Peter Walker, as you see here, the work of Martha Schwartz, George Hargraves, again, Martha Schwartz, which was really privileging notions of aesthetics, configuration, the collection of different geometries, over perhaps the performative in the way in which people come together, the way in which spaces are designed to take different installations. And it's really to point to the fact that there is this progression that took place away from the great gold totes that Martha was installing in public spaces. To really remember and I suppose come back to the fact that we are creative beings. You know, we as people occupy and appropriate space in a way that we feel best suits our needs and our demands. And I love this image that just shows that, you know, we find those places to really interact with one another in the public space. There was a very clear stepping off point from the research of the book where we went away from necessarily design as art or landscape as art and the arrangement of space as aesthetics and as pieces of art to more this idea of creating these platforms where different kinds of events and activities could take place. And this is City Stage by West 8 in Rotterdam. They really started to usher in a new kind of thinking in the way in which public spaces could be used. It's focused on the ideas of the edge condition, which Jan Gale talks a lot about. So the image in the center is the plan. On the left is the sunny side of the space that fronts onto a wide open, flexible area. And also what was unique about this project at the time in 1996, when it seemed to be this fulcrum where we shifted, is West 8, Adrian, who's in West 8, introduced these flexible moving crane lights that also brought a different kind of animation into the space. So throughout the book, I look at each of these different case studies to try to understand what the component parts are that are making it work. How big are they? What are the different elements that sit within the space? So this is just an example to give you for how I've begun to look at those spaces and deconstruct their component elements. And you can see in this image here really how the edge condition has a really strong formality to it as far as where people sit and looking out into a flexible area. And this open, hard paved space really then becomes a platform for different installations, different configurations that happen over time. The importance also of seeing the lights, not just as something to light the space for safety reasons, but this notion that through how you configure the lighting can transform the participants into performers. This is a fixed performance, but also the idea of people moving through the space, going from A to B and being lit in these spotlights, they become a type of performer. At the same time that West 8 had designed a space, there was a shift happening in academia and literature, and in recovering landscapes in particular, James Corner and a body of different thinkers and theorists and practitioners also began to talk a bit more about this idea of the performative side of design of landscapes as stages and platforms. And one particular line that Alex Wall speaks of in his essay, here the term landscape no longer refers to prospects of pastoral innocence, but rather invokes the functioning matrix of connective tissue that organizes not only objects in space, but also the dynamic processes and events that move through them. So we're no longer talking about trees and grass and the arrangement of elements in the space. It's seen now as a really strong performative milieu and different stages for these things to take place. So what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking through these 4 key headings. For those of you that aren't in London, hopefully you still find this quite interesting. But for those of us that are in the UK, you'll recognize many of the spaces that I'll show. The other is the rise of the installation culture, which is now a global phenomenon. It's happening pretty much everywhere. Uses, how the uses of a space are beginning to shape the design. And then finally, ideas of reconfigured space, which starts to point, I think, to an exciting future for flexibility.
Cannon, could I just launch our first poll at this point? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So for everybody listening, we're just polling 4 times during these presentations, and we'd be really grateful if you'd take part in these. Just hopefully they're completely understandable, but it would be really interesting to get your responses as we progress through. So please do vote on this one now, and then we'll, oh, you can't see what I'm seeing. I think I'm the only one that can see the results coming in, but it's quite interesting watching people's views popping up and how they shift from one to another. Again, I apologise, some of these are a little bit London-centric, but we'll get an idea, I think, of what people are missing. So what do you miss most about pre-COVID life in our current public spaces? I'll give you a few more minutes because there are a few who haven't yet voted. Anybody else umming and ahhing? Thank you. Oh, nearly that. Nearly there. And there's a clear leader at the moment. So 1 or 2 of you still to go, I think, if you can give us your most missed activity. Okay, we'll call it a date. So people and the buzz, that's 17% of you miss. And the outright leader is casual encounters at 53%. People watching, 5%. I thought that would be higher. Pop-up activities, Covent Garden, that kind of mime artists and all the people you see around there, that's 11%. And events and installations, example there is Clerkenwell Design Week, but it could be London Festival of Architecture, that sort of thing. That's 15%. So a clear winner is casual encounters. So thank you for that. And you're off again, Cannon.
Wonderful, thank you. So for many that are on the call, perhaps in London, might recognize this space. For those outside of the UK, this is Somerset House, one of our most treasured, I would say, cultural epicenters, where there's all sorts of different fixed events that happen throughout the year, but also the way in which they've curated the space to bring the activities and the installations that are taking place in the building, working with the local artists to bring it into public space. So this was before 2000, this is 1999, when it was still a car park for the Inland Revenue Service, which is hard to believe when you see the scenes of how it behaves now. Sorry, I missed a slide, let me go back. There we go. So it now hosts the Film for Screen series throughout every year, or it used to. Hopefully that comes back soon. Skate is another fixed event that happens. It has an element where it brings people together around music and concerts. And what's interesting also about that scheme is that on the day-to-day, when it's not being used for these large events, it has water as a key element that creates that ambiance for the day-to-day. Another key moment for us here in London was when the traffic was removed on the northern side of Trafalgar Square to link the National Theatre to Trafalgar Square itself. And what's also quite interesting about this, which I've learned, is that the image on the right is after the removal of the traffic. And you can see buskers in this scene. There's a lot of street art that happens, but you don't see any of that taking place in Trafalgar Square itself. And the difference in what's going on there is that Trafalgar Square itself is managed by the Greater London Authority. whereas the space that we're looking at in this image is operated by Westminster. So they have different bylaws that allow different activities to take place. So these hidden forces that are unseen and how they actually influence what goes on in public space is also very interesting. And the way in which the square itself, Trafalgar Square itself, is increasingly being used as this platform, the stage for different installations, community gatherings, etc. The other great piece about Trafalgar Square, which I think is also ushered in much of the installation culture, is the fourth plinth. The latest installation, which has just arrived, includes a drone and a fly and a giant ice cream. But the thing about it is that it has this element of anticipation. We know that there's something coming and we know that it's going to change. And the drama and intrigue of this is far greater than if this was a single fixed element. And again, an example of how, again, studying where these things sit within the space, the scale of those, the different elements that sit within there, and where those moments are for activation. The other key thing, and I think this is not just London-centric, this is happening throughout the world, is the use of water as a great way of making sure the space has a really strong quality to it on the everyday. So when it's not being used for bringing people together or installations, it has an amazing ability to create a sense of place. This is the Victorian Albert Museum by Kim Wilkie, and the central water feature that you see there was designed to be able to be ginned away to turn it into a platform. But also what's great about this image is you can start to see a different kind of activator, as it were. This is Akim Mengez's pavilion, which was being built by a robot on the site. We could see these elements being constructed. So this idea of having a real life in the moment fabrication process that brings the life to the space. It's not just a performance by people, that there's a different kind of way that we're beginning to be engaged when we're in public spaces. And you can see in these images the way in which how that works, how it begins to change the split, change the place. The bottom images where you have taken the same place, where you have the water, the reflectivity, the playfulness of the water, and then that's drained away for a village fete. And it's used for London Design Week. So every year, this is the headquarters or the epicenter of that, and there's an installation that also happens within that space. The other model that's interesting is Pottersfield Park. And the reason I find this really particularly useful is it was set up as a trust. So any activities that are taking place on this lawn space are usually around, it's a marketing platform in a way. So companies will pay a certain amount of money to have the backdrop of Tower Bridge to give that sense of a postcode, the significance of that icon. But all the money that's generated is used to pay for 2 head gardeners to look after Pete Oldhoff's garden, which is to the south of this space. It was designed by Gross Max, and the other quite interesting thing, I've mentioned the proximity to Tower Bridge, is what this bridge itself does for enlivening the space. And you can see this sequence of images where people are probably just walking about in their day-to-day routines, or they might be on a tourist itinerary. But as the bridge starts to go through this incredible choreography, people stop, they gather, they take in this moment, and then the bridge closes and they move on and they go about their day. So being mindful, I think, of those elements, those borrowed infrastructures, borrowed views, and how we design and think about activating space is also an important lesson here. But to go back to what this reciprocity between the platform as a place where it's generating an income for the park, but it's also activating the space. So they have different marketing campaigns, but it's not just a billboard that says, you know, come and see our brand. They have to do it in a certain way that it creates something for the general public that are moving through the space. So while there's this whole colorful orchestration that's happening on the grass, the same thing is happening in Pete's garden in a softer, and I call this a softer activation, as it were. So with people that live in this area or move through the garden on a day-to-day basis, a weekly basis, the importance of seeing change through the planting, through the seasonality, is as important or speaks to the same effect that the curation and the activities have on the lawn space. So it's an amazing juxtaposition and dynamic that's happening in this space. So it's in a state of constant change, both with the planting and with the elements that are happening on the lawn. So if we move on then to the rise of the installation culture, and really, as I said, it started with, I think, the fourth plinth. And then there were two key pavilion moments. The first is this one, which is PS1 at MoMA in Brooklyn, in New York, which every year it hosts a party like this, which is around music called the Mix, but also it has this moment about architecture. So people are drawn to see the object, to see the installation, but it is a chance to mingle, to hear music. So that combination of icon and experience is really important also. We see it with the Serpentine Pavilion, going back to those ideas of anticipation, excitement, where when the pavilion is in front of the Serpentine Gallery in Kensington Gardens, it is just a flat piece of empty lawn. But for us that live here, we know that for a period of time during the summer, it is an absolute destination. People flock to it, they come to see the pavilion, and we know that it's going to bring an architect that hasn't done anything in the UK. So there's an important lesson here for the repetition, the regularity of these installations, which has started to pick up momentum around the world. This is the second installation at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Again, the same model of trying to bring new audiences, more footfall to their gallery. Ideas around closing streets. This is very topical now as we see COVID change the way in which we see streets and the reappropriation of the streets for places as people. This particular one, though, is an installation that happens every summer in Montreal. And they close the street and they associate an installation here with whatever the theme that's taking place within the museum. So again, they're connecting the internal program of the museum to the external streetscape. Flatiron in New York, again, I think this is in its 5th or 6th year as far as a different so this is a competition, someone picks it up every year and they install a new installation. This also speaks to the importance of creating elements and putting things in the public realm that are interactive. The quality of these latest installations are not necessarily something that you solely look at, take a picture, put it on Instagram and move on, but you're encouraged to stop and to linger and to encounter it in a different way because it is interactive with things like the hammock as you see in this image here. In Robson Radio, which is in Vancouver, again, this was an installation that was driven by a competition. It went through 5 cycles and it picked up enough momentum that it allowed the city planners to be able to convert this from a road that is closed only in the summer to make it a permanently closed public space. And I'm intrigued really to know if this space as a fixed linear public space has the same drama and excitement that it had when it was just simply a temporary installation. In Times Square, we see with the Valentine Heart competition, again, that's I think in its 3rd, 4th, 5th year now. And each year it seems to get more interesting, more complex, more engaging. The other phenomenon that we're starting to see is traveling interactive installation. So this installation by was originally designed for Plastic Festival, again in Montreal, which was designed by Daus Lestage, but it's since moved and lifted and gone around from historic Harvard Yard, as we can see in this image, to the newly opened Coal Drops Yard here in London, underneath the Thomas Heatherwick building. So again, there's this moment now where we're creating these spaces and being able to deploy elements like this that can come and enliven a place, bring new audiences, bring new footfall into a place, and help to kickstart and introduce an initial disruption that picks up momentum and starts to create a real sense of place. Uses that are shaping design. So we know now that there's the shift away from landscape and public realm just purely as an exercise in composition and aesthetics, that it's about bringing people together and the uses that start to draw people into the public space. And this is probably the greatest example really of, sorry, getting notifications here, sorry. Examples here where the actual use of a space starts to determine the configuration, the organization, the arrangement of the overall landscape. So this is Navy Yard Central Green by James Cornerfield Operations. Many of you may have seen it in publications and architectural press. But what's interesting about it is each of those nested rings is really driven by the type of use. So you have the pétanque bocce courts in the center, you have an amphitheater, you have an outdoor fitness area, you have hammock groves and picnic tables, and it's all held together then by this social track that if you go around 5 times, you've run a mile. So each of them has a very prescribed and prescriptive intent behind it, but also there's elements where you can move through the space and still feel like you're moving through a landscape. Other examples are the goods line in Sydney that Aspect Studios have done, which is more of a linear journey similar to the High Line. And again, this was probably one of the more interesting ones of being able to deconstruct and understand those different room components. Again, getting a sense of the scale, how it's organized, what the arrangement is. And I've come across this quote recently. It's in the Downsview Park competition case book that was written by Julia Zerniak. And I think it really speaks to the age that we were in before COVID hit, where we were starting to see a lot of design for flexibility that was resulting in spaces that sort of lacked any real thought. It was just about, let's get an open, unobstructed space out and then roll out a bunch of program to it. So what Anita's calling us to do here, instead of flexibility, thus we might now think more precisely in terms of scales of undecidability. By this, I mean the landscape's capacity for precision of form, notwithstanding flexibility of program, for the precisely open rather than the vaguely loose. Through this framework, we are able to reject the notion that the landscapes are either naturalistic and formless or object-like and formful. And I love that line, precisely open rather than vaguely loose. It speaks to the importance of really understanding the scale of space, really understanding and getting deep under the skin of what is it going to feel like to be in that space on any given day? How many different configurations can it hold? How might people be able to use it in ways that we haven't even thought of yet? The last couple of ideas are around reconfigured space and the idea that we as participants have a role in being able to shape the environment that we're sitting in. So this is Lent Space by Interborough Studios. It was a meanwhile use scheme where there's a series of panels you can see in the upper part of this image where you could open those up to create moments where you could have social scenes where you could stop and speak to each other. If you wanted to close it and frame it and have a very strong edge, you can do that. But this very simple, it's not a difficult thing, but this simple ability to reconfigure a small portion of the landscape and change it in a way that suits your needs is something that is really important. And Nick will come to talk about William H. White's social life of small urban spaces, where there's the scene in the movie where a woman comes, lifts up a chair. And that ability to make a very small change in your environment is really important. It gives us a sense of ownership of the space. The work of Matthew Mazzotta, where he takes objects and he designs certain moments where they are seen as a set piece, but they can be unfolded to create a series of different installations as well. Here in Nebraska, called Storefront Theater, where a series of steps unfold. They bring in a movie theater by Tractor, and the community is brought together. Incredible moment. I'd love to see more tractors in all of our public spaces. You may have come across this, where a series of seats that are driven by hydraulics, and it takes and converts a space that's really about movement and transitions on the corner of two junctions, and makes it quite a playful place for people to come together. The other thing I'm noticing, and perhaps you've also seen this now, is elements and furniture that does something that's, say, greater than the sum of its parts. And in that sense, it's a place to sit, but it's not a bench. It's a place to play, but it's not a playground. It's an outdoor gym, or a place to work out, but it's not an outdoor gym. And I think there's something really important here for us to think about how we can think about furniture, particularly for Romy and her team at Vestra, to design objects that that require a bit of interpretation. It draws people and audiences in because they're not quite sure what it is initially. And that ability to sit on it in different ways, to interact with it in different ways, I think is really, really interesting and really important. And I'll close and just segue into Nick's piece on proximity, looking at some of the latest, I would say, images that we're seeing of how people are sitting in public spaces now and being able to come and use outdoor green spaces within this very set, fixed parameter. This is in San Francisco, and what I find fascinating about it is there's kind of an activation and a staging going on here through these painted lines that are bringing people together and giving a set sense of where they can sit. And you can see it's interesting to look at. It's got really strong geometry, but also when you see people sitting in those spaces, this catches up. There's a certain amount of kind of program to it, which I find really fascinating. If you could almost stop and study it for quite a while, trying to interpret all of the different pieces that are going on and what people are doing. What are their specific arrangements of space? What do they need in their circle and in their diameter? And with that, I will finish. Romy, if you have another poll or to pass on to Nick.
I do. Thanks very much, Cannon. You managed that amazingly, especially with the Teams pop-ups. We all suffer from these things. So I shared all my emails with everybody earlier. I'm glad I'm not alone. No, that was brilliant. Thank you. We do have another poll, but I don't want to keep you waiting too long to hear from Nick as well. So I'm going to share this one with you. This is multiple choice, so not just one of these. So choose any and all that you agree with. So how will events in public space look and feel in a post-COVID-19 world? We were trying to give a good spread here of positive, negative, maybe slightly ambivalent, which some of you are going for. And it's hard to say really, because we're obviously in the point we are now, and we don't know what things will be like in 6 months or 12 months time. So we thought this would be interesting. Also, safety. Are fewer people around a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, less traffic gives more space for people to walk and cycle and just dwell. So, you know, there's a big question around all of this, but we've got a few more of you that can participate, if you will. And this one is not nearly as clear in terms of a winner yet. So few more of you, I think 5 or 6 of you still to go. If that yes, it's starting to make all the difference actually. Those people that have been thinking about it more, I think it's coming through loud and clear. Okay, I think we're there now. Thank you. So the winner outright at 46% is lacking atmosphere and no buzz. And I think, you know, when you look at somewhere like Times Square now compared to what Times Square would have looked like, that's a really strong indicator of that. And then everything else is around sort of 15–20%, except for no difference, which is at 4%. So one of you thinks that it will make no difference at all. That's interesting. We're all wanting the buzz and the atmosphere and feeling like it sadly may not happen. I think I can share the results here with you now, so you can see those for yourselves. Well, actually, sorry, I missed that because it's at the bottom. Transformational is also at 42%. So we do think it's going to be different, but maybe not quite sure how. So we can make this information available to you afterwards. But for now, I think we should move on to Nick's presentation. Do you want to stop sharing, Cannon? I think Nick should then be able to start off almost immediately. Thanks. Whenever you're ready, Nick.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Great, okay. Well, thanks very much, Romy, for inviting us, and thanks, Cannon, for a fantastic presentation. Really, really interesting act to follow. And I'm going to sort of pick up really where Cannon was arriving at. So how are people actually using this space, and how is that actually reflected in what the space is? And actually the poll results are actually really quite interesting for me, as we'll see as we go through. So for me, the thing about one of the things about COVID and all of the stuff that we've got with COVID is to do with this confusion between physical distancing and social distancing. We have this expression about social distancing, and I'm going to say that I think social distancing is a disastrous term and we should drop it. I think what we're talking about is physical distancing and how we actually think about the space between us when we are being social, and that's a very, very different concept. So I'm going to move on, because my starting point, if I can get this to move, I don't seem to be able to change my screen. It seems to have stuck itself somehow. Let's try this. There we go. Is that the way I look at space is that people are the measure. So it isn't just a matter of actually how do we put people in space, how do we design space for people to go in, but actually people are the way in which we look at space, and how they move around in it and how they interact with each other is a sign of the qualities, if you like, of that space. And that means that we have to sort of think about how they interact both with their immediate environment, how are they dealing with the street furniture, with the way the street is, the way the road is, how are they actually dealing with each other and interacting with each other? Because Homo sapiens is a social species. We get along, we operate as a species, and we survive as a species through sociality, about how we interact with people. And that is not just a physical thing that we can see on the streets. It's actually part of our hardwired neurological system. And what happens is that we have the environment that we are in, whatever that environment is, that is detected through our senses, through the sensorial pathways, through eyes, ears, and nose, and skin, and so on. That's then processed in the brain, first of all in the sensory parts of the brain, and then into the central processing, where you start to interpret that data, turn it into a perception, which is then drives the whole business of what you do with your preconscious and conscious brain. And the whole thing about that is that the preconscious brain is really where the vast bulk of the brain's activity happens. You're just simply not aware of it. The brain has a capacity of processing about 11 million bits of information per second. Your conscious awareness, its capacity to deal with conscious awareness, is about 80 bits per second. So the vast majority of how you interact with the environment is actually you are completely unaware. And so we can move that on to thinking there is a little nuance to this, which is, of course, that we also emit signals into that environment. We are part of the environment. How I appear in an environment is also how you will perceive that environment as part of it. And therefore, the 100,000 or so bits per second that I emit through gestures, through expressions, through raising an eyebrow, facial expressions, and so on, that is something which you receive as part of the environment and goes through all that process. So we have this sort of cyclic process. That then turns into the way in which we change the environment. So here is a sort of representation of a person, if you like, in an environment. They sense that environment, it's processed in their cortex, they perceive stuff. That means that they move, let's say they move to another part of the environment, and then you've now changed the environment. So we have a new environment, and the whole process repeats, and then you have another environment, and so on. And that goes through time. And that process is going on the whole time. And that's kind of the hardwired bit of how we interact with the environment. On top of that then comes things like your emotions, your feelings, etc. So into that environment, let's now think about how does all that fit with physical distancing? Well, Edward Hall, anthropologist in 1940s, 50s in the United States, he set out the idea of social spacing and talked about how people, he called it the hidden dimension. And he sort of categorized space in urban area in 4 kind of groups. One, which he called public, which is around about somewhere sort of between 3 and 8 meters distance from you. That's, you might be able to detect a person there. You might even recognize them if you know them. And you will decide on some kind of response. If you don't know the person, this is where you might be thinking, is that a shady individual or not? It's kind of where you identify the situation. The second one, he called the social space. And in that space, you you could recognize a person. You can certainly tell what gender they are. You can start to see whether they might be smiling or grimacing. Some things might be more subtle and you might not be able to gather that at that. You might be able to start inferring a mood, and therefore you might start responding to the fact that this person looks as if they're scowling or they're looking as if they're happy, for example. So you're kind of acknowledging them as a person and able to sort of begin the process of responding to them. If you come a bit closer, you come into what he called the personal space. This is the space in which you have conversations. You will have people that you know, and you can have that conversation. Why you can do that? Well, this is the piece that Edward Hall never got into. And this is all about the science of that. Why is it that you have a conversation at 1.2 meters? Well, it's because that's how your ears work, how your eyes work, how your voice works. It means that you can hear comfortably, you can see the gestures, you can see the eye movements. Actually, you can see 3 people at the same time without moving your head. So you can actually have a group conversation with 3 other people, but you can't with 4. And that kind of thing becomes quite particular in that distance and a large part of our societal activity. Then you have the intimate space, and the intimate space is where you will be familiar with a person, and very few people are actually in this distance. And if you're not invited into that space, that is aggressive. And so it's not a comfortable space unless it is with somebody you do. And those images on the left there are from one of young Gale's books. And essentially what you're seeing is how much of that person you can kind of detect and with your visual sense, and what that actually kind of means. And you can see how the ability to recognize and deal with a person, engage with them, changes as that distance changes. And that is kind of the basis of proxemics. And Hall did all this as a huge amount of observations in New York City to be able to get those kind of figures. And he noticed that it was pretty generic, and it's pretty much the same. And in fact, it seems to be the same anywhere in the world. And people initially said, well, people in some countries actually are much more distant than in other countries where they hug and embrace all the time. But actually what we found is that that is true for the point of greeting and the point of taking leave, but not for the actual conversation. And so the characteristics of whether you bow to greet somebody, which tends to place you further apart, or whether you hug and embrace to greet somebody, which brings you closer together, actually, when you have the actual conversation, they will move to something around 1.25 meters. And that is the key to proxemics, and why proxemics has been driving urban design is because it was a kind of manifestation of that desired social spacing. This is how you deal with people where you want to deal with them. And the question then is, what drives social spacing? And it is to do with how your eyes work and your ears work and your mouth works. But there's actually perhaps a more subtle thing. And that is that we think that social spacing is actually based on time. So if we go back to those physical distances, how long it would take you to walk, for example, to the edge of that public space is around about 8 seconds. And to be able to move inside that social space is up to around about 3 seconds. Personal space is quite close. It's to get from where you're standing to actually embrace the other person, for example, is going to take you probably less than a second. And so we can turn this into the way in which we enact social interactions. So if we thought, and we'll come to the thing in a minute, if we thought about this, how long does it take to greet somebody? So I'll leave you with your poll, and you can tell me about your sense of those spaces.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Sorry, before you moved on, I just wanted to get this in at the appropriate time. So we'll do this very quickly and try and avoid ruining your flow. There are quite a few people thinking about this, I think, carefully. No, they're coming in now, and it's coming out strong. Yeah, coming out very strongly in one particular area, interestingly. So we've got a handful more people. If you can get involved and give us your thoughts, that would be really helpful. few more. I think we've got 2 or 3 left. It's actually coming out pretty clearly, so I'll stop now. Thank you, everybody. So this is the result. 1.25 meters is a clear winner.
There you go. Very, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'll
Okay.
go now. Thank you.
Okay, that's very interesting, because previously the thing that people were looking out for and missing and so on actually turns into things like the casual encounters, the worry about losing the atmosphere and the buzz and things is all around that kind of distance. It's very, very consistent and very, very interesting. So how long does it take to greet somebody? Well, actually it's about, well, it depends where you are, of course. If you were walking towards, the 2 people were walking towards each other, from the point at which you might recognize that's a person who might be greetable, as opposed to somebody you might want to run away from, it takes about 3 to 4 seconds to do that. And that's pretty consistent as well. Obviously it depends a bit on your walking speed. But interestingly, there's another little function that comes in here, and that is that your brain deals with stimuli in a quite ordered way. And what it does is it aggregates them into temporal blocks of around about 3 to 4 seconds. This is why young Gale's point about the shops in Copenhagen that you walk past and it takes you 4 or 5 seconds to walk past these shops in Copenhagen, why that feels so comfortable is that you're changing your stimulus every 4 seconds or so, and that matches the brain's ability to lump, to aggregate signals together into these sort of chunks. If you have a pulse, for example, that is more than that, your pulses are more than 4 seconds apart, your brain just treats them as separate objects. Whereas if it's less than that, it will start to couple them together and it will begin to understand them and start actually to interpret them. So for example, a grandfather clock says tick tock. It doesn't say tick tick. Why does it say tick tock? Well, it says tick tock because actually those sounds occur about every second. And the brain it takes about 4 seconds for the brain to establish itself that this is a regular ongoing pulse. And then it says one must be more important than the other. And so I'm going to impose an emphasis on one and not on the other. And so you think that the sound is tick tock. There is a different sound, even though actually the 2 sounds are absolutely identical. And if I were to play you a recording and just swap them around, you would never know the difference. It's a neurological thing it has done to simply place that in time. That means you can make sense of the world. 3 to 4 seconds is kind of how you make sense of the world. And so that starts to become quite important. And part of that sense of the world is sociality. And so it's kind of based on you being able to do things in that kind of way. So we can look at time. And the thing about time is that it actually is a very amorphous topic. You know, we tend to think, especially nowadays, we tend to think about hours and minutes and seconds and stuff like that. And of course, we try to get smaller and smaller and smaller as we get finer and finer and finer. But actually, time isn't anything like that. It's much more of a duration. So here's another way of looking at time. And this is about the pace of time. And so the blue one, the fashion, the cycle for passion is very, very fast. You know, fashions change very rapidly. Even mobile phones might even work in that kind of, well, because they're kind of a fashion statement, but they go very fast. If once you've got out of the season every few months, it's no good anymore. You have to do something else. On the other hand, commerce tends to work on an annual cycle. They have a business case, they have business plans, they have accounts, they all work on years. Maybe they go up to 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe for a business plan, but essentially it's years. On the other hand, infrastructure is decades. You know, trains last 40 years, roads last 50 years, and so on. So they're sort of decadal things. On the other hand, governance, changing in systems of governance is incredibly difficult to do and tends to only happen in periods of centuries or more apart. And if you start to think about how governance systems have changed, even in this country, it's a pretty slow business apart from odd little bits of detail. Culture, even slower. Culture goes on for thousands of years. You know, we are in a culture which has been around for a few thousand years, It's not to say it will go on forever, but it's a very slow pace of change. To change a culture is very, very difficult, the deep culture. And then, of course, nature itself goes on for eons. And therefore, you have these sort of things. Now, the thing about this is that you can only really get things to work when they all line up. If you try to change something in infrastructure without getting the governance right, you may well find that the two never quite match up. And if you look at things like privatization of the railways, for example, it's one of the reasons for that is it just is a tension with the governance. It just doesn't work. So you have these kind of things, and you're going from very fast to very slow. And that's kind of, if you like, the environmental world. If I look at the person, I can take a similar model. I can say, well, we can go from, we were talking about responses, the actual response of your hearing system is in milliseconds. The way you react to that is in countable seconds. Doing an action might take you a few minutes. The activity you're doing might be a couple of hours. This is going to be around about an hour. On the other hand, your agenda is probably figuring out in weeks. And if you were going to devise a schedule, you'll be thinking in terms of months, maybe stretching to a year or something like that. So you also have this shift from fast to slow, but you also are going from that pre-conscious unknown thing that you really don't know about, but nevertheless you are biologically responding to, and what you actually know about because it's written in your diary. If we then put all those into one diagram of the pace of time, we go from eons to milliseconds, and we're doing this all the time. And in fact, you can start to see how that changes the kinds of things that happen from the pre-conscious unknown things to the conscious, recognizing things, into doing things, into arranging things, predicting things. And maybe I can think about something in 10 years, maybe even stretch out to what would happen in 100 years' time. Once you get beyond 1,000 years, it's sort of kind of unseeable, really. If you then say, well, we divided those up, on the left, on the longer periods, we have the environment, in the shorter periods, we have the person. What's all this got to do with social spacing? Well, because kind of in the middle is that person who is interacting with all these environments and changing those situations, changing those by doing actions, changing that understanding and the perception of all these by combining all of these time periods and time paces into the same thing. And when I want to go and find a place to sit, that is what I'm doing. And so it's very interesting that because the brain processes hearing far, far faster than it can process vision, up to about 10 meters, the ability to respond to hearing is far faster than the ability to respond to vision. And here we are in this hypervision society where we think we see everything. But actually, in that up to that 10 meters radius, we are actually dealing with sound. And that applies whether you're in an orchestra or it applies whether you're in a street. And remember those halls' distances. In social space, this is in Havana, Cuba. And what you see here is a street, which is actually the boundary between the pedestrianized historic city center and the sort of trafficked place on the other side. To mark out that barrier and to stop the traffic from going in, they wanted to put bollards, but because of the sanctions, they can't buy concrete bollards. So they what they had lots of was 18th century British bronze cannons. And so they used those as bollards and they stuck them in the ground. And then the laws of physics point out that if you put a 18th century British bronze cannon in the ground far enough to be a bollard, it's about the right height for somebody to lean on. So you can see the guy there leaning on this bollard. And what you are then creating is that social space. Look at the distances between those people. These are social distances. These are people having conversations, having interactions with each other. The difference between the pedestrianized space and the traffic space is a social space. And that is encouraged by that bollard. And we can look at benches. We saw some benches earlier. If you look at the one on the right, this is a bench. The four women are having a conversation on that bench. Look how hard it is for them to have that conversation. They're having to work very, very hard. The two women on either end almost sitting off the bench in order to be able to have that conversation. If you look at the one on the left, those benches are curved. Those benches are designed so that you can sit on the outside and face outwards, or you can sit on the inside and have a conversation. The guys sitting on the right-hand side of that, much easier to have a conversation in that curved bench world than it is for those 4 women on the straight bench world. And if you wanted a piece of privacy, you can have it by sitting on the other side. The interesting piece on this is actually in Nicosia. The interesting thing here is when a new person arrives, they talk to the inside circle, not to the outside circle. And that's because it is a more welcoming place socially, and the distances work, the eye contact works, the hearing ability works, and therefore the bench is working for the people's senses, so it becomes a more social sense. What we're doing in our work is to actually create a laboratory. This is a laboratory we're just in the process of constructing, in which we can build whole social environment, test them with people, so that we can combine the physiology and the neurology of those milliseconds and seconds with the more stage kind of social environment paces of time of the minutes and the hours and the sense of sociality that we have between people. And we can actually understand that and try it with people and see how much we can actually create a social space that is truly social. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. That's absolutely brilliant. And who'd have thought that these things can all be brought back to benches and cannons? How appropriate. So thank you both. We have one last poll, which I'll just launch for you now. And it's really just a question about what makes you uncomfortable or apprehensive about a public space that you might find yourself in. You know, what's the most worrying thing? And actually, I think this is multiple choice again, so it can be more than one, but what's the most off-putting aspect that makes you feel very unnerved? Just while you're doing that, if you haven't looked at Pearl online, you really must do. It's absolutely incredible. Every time we talk, Nick, Cannon, and us at Vestra, you know, we find out more and more. It's absolutely fascinating, this whole topic and what's going on. So do have a look, because that's going to be absolutely incredible when it all opens up fairly soon now, I think.
Next May.
Oh, next May. Okay, yeah, I know it had been slowed down a little bit, but it'll be an amazing space to test out a lot of these theories. Okay, I think we're pretty much there, with most of you having voted now. Couple more of you if you want to press the buttons. I'll finish it now, because I'm aware we're ending time and we've got a couple of questions. So here you go. Those are the answers to that one. And 3 leading: high noise, litter and smells. But actually there are a couple not far behind that, so nothing surprising there, I guess. But yeah, interesting. I hope you've found everything today as fascinating as we have. We've got a few questions, Nick and Cannon, if you want to come back. I know some of you may have to go because we are at time now, but if those of you who can hang on can do so for another 10 minutes maybe, that would be great. So we've got a couple of questions. One of them is, how do these timings that you were talking about, Nick, earlier, in terms of the sort of spaces and distances as well, how do these timings change with age or dementia?
They don't really change very much at all. I think what we haven't really detected a big change, certainly in older age. Dementia is a whole other issue. It's very interesting that with our dementia people, one of the things that sticks with dementia, with people with dementia very strongly, is music. And that's partly because music's processed in a different part of the brain from things like words and so on. And people can remember music, they can remember tunes, and they remember rhythm very, very well. And a lot of these time relationship where you're kind of relating time to something is actually done through rhythm. So actually, I think they find rhythmic things that are even predictable kind of things actually very reassuring. So rhythm is and with music, you know, with melody and so on associated to that, actually sort of sticks quite well. And I think the sense of the pulse of the brain, it's still operating, the brain is operating at the same speed. It's not necessarily the brain is slowing down, maybe your physical responses are slowing, but the brain can be pretty sharp in older people. And I think it still actually goes on at pretty much the same kind of speeds.
Oh, okay, and thank you. And maybe one for you, Cannon. This is from Paul Reynolds. You may know him. Hello, Paul. In an opinion piece in The Guardian yesterday, Norman Foster suggests that rather than changing anything, COVID has merely hastened and magnified trends that were already apparent before the virus struck. Do the panel agree? Maybe one for you, though, Cannon.
Yeah, I was reading that question and trying to ponder what.
Sorry, I've picked on you.
It's an interesting point, I suppose. I would suggest perhaps maybe some of the trends that maybe existed were we were drifting closer and closer to being an I society with our iPhones and our iPads and walking around with our own individual music. But I think there was always a counterpoint to that because we were brought together in certain ways in public space. And now that we're all, I think, working from home and entirely isolated from, particularly for extroverts that need that and crave that sociability, I would say that there was certainly not a trend that was suggesting that we would be this remote from each other and this isolated and this detached. And I do think that there's an overwhelming sense that people do want to return, though that somehow, to coming together in public spaces. You can see some of it re-emerging in places like King's Cross. I know you guys were up there with an installation recently, where there's efforts to try to keep some sense of the enlivenment that happens in public space, because I do think it brings people a certain amount of a quality of life and a sense of well-being when they can see other people interacting in a public space that way. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Nick, on that question.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting. I'm very, when you have people singing from balconies and dancing on rooftops and even clapping for the NHS or whatever, these are actually expressions of sociality when you are not allowed to have a distance small enough to be able to do that. And I think it is actually very important to us to have that social distance. The thing for me is how do we actually deal with if we do have to maintain a larger space. I think the whole design of the social space, the public realm, is going to be so important in actually enabling that sociality when maybe the physical distances between people might not be so easy. And so I think there is a strong. I totally agree. I think that COVID sort of put everything into an emergency stop mode, and suddenly people discovered things. They discovered they could walk down the road, as if it was a shock, and then thought, well, actually, maybe this is not such a bad thing to do. And I think the great thing about the way forward is how do we actually capitalize on this? This is a fantastic opportunity to break the chain that we were going on. And start to think differently about how we go to work, how we use space, how we use transport. Why do we supply 3,000 people to the cheese grater and they can't? It takes 3 hours to get them in the building because of the COVID capacity. So why are we telling everybody to turn up at 9 o'clock? Why don't we just rethink the way that we work and so on? And I think a lot of employers have discovered that jobs that they thought you had to nail somebody to the desk to do actually managed to be done when they were not even in sight, that they were at home doing these things. And that's made them think a bit about how work can change. So I think there's a huge opportunity in the public realm to look at sociality and make the world fit sociality rather than force sociality into a form that fits the world. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity.
Maybe there's a few more positive trends also that, as Nick was speaking there, things about how we're reappropriating the street and creating more space for cyclists, better walkability, wider pavements, all these things that perhaps those were the trends that there was an undercurrent of this trend. And we just needed something like this to really allow it to surface and take hold. And we are in emergency break scenario too, but I think we're also emergency go in some instances to get some of these projects through that can actually improve the walkability and the amount of foot space that we have in the public realm, the quality of those spaces also. So there is a positive. There are some positive trends actually that maybe this has fast tracked.
I agree. And I think the sad thing would be if we just simply went back to the way it was before, and that would be a kind of failure, really, of human ingenuity. I think we have to figure out how do we actually move forward in that positive direction and make the most of it.
Well, the last question then might feed into that. Under the purview of distances between people dictating comfort or interaction and the law of perception and grouping, what kinds of spaces serve as stimulus to attract or group people for casual encounters? And with COVID dictating 1.8 meters, how will that change? That's quite a question. Maybe we can spotlight a couple of thoughts.
Well, one quick one I'd say is that COVID doesn't dictate 1.8 meters. I mean, actually, nobody knows what the distance is that you should be in order not to catch COVID from somebody. And it could be well more than 1.8 meters. So certainly some of the work we've been doing would suggest that you can have COVID virions in the floating in the air for 16, 17 hours, and it's still viable. So in 16 or 17 hours, you can go quite a long way.
Yes.
So I think it's going to be around how we design society, and we can figure out what to do with COVID, I think. But we need to design society so that we get the best social interactions between people, because that is what gives us the solidity of society, and that's what it's about. If it isn't a sort of dictatorial thing, you should be this far apart. It's about creating a society, and I think that the space that we have between things, whether it's between houses or between parks or whatever it is, those spaces are how we actually physically enable that society to form. And that is why the relationship is very interesting, and why I think time is a really useful thing to bring into it, because we tend to think about how you get people through a space. Certainly, flows of pedestrians, all of the work, Fruin's work in the States about how many people can you get down a footway as a mass capacity kind of thing. Actually, why aren't we looking at how people stop? We should be thinking about, actually, we want people to stop in a place, and to linger and to enjoy, and then they will spend more money actually in the place if they are enjoying themselves there, and they can do it, and they can get to shops and restaurants and things like that. How do we actually design the space that somebody wants to be in, as opposed to something which one wants to get through as fast as possible?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's most of the work landscape architects do. Sorry.
I was just going to add, I think there's something also about the importance of providing spaces that have a lot of options for people. Increasingly, I think it's now creating more and more seating. So rather than seeing, if you think about it, the standard bench that we might see in parks and public spaces are actually now individual seats, aren't they? Because people don't tend to sit next to each other in that way anymore. So in the designs we're doing, we're certainly trying to come up with imaginative ways that we can create long runs of seats, or over provide the amount of seating, knowing that there's going to be gaps between where people want to sit, that we won't have those clusters of people sitting in the way that we usually would. And also those images I showed earlier of Jeppy Hines' modified social benches, which there's a whole different array of ways in which people might be able to sit and occupy those spaces. And I think there's something where if you have an object like that does require a bit of interpretation, or trying to figure out what it is, that's naturally going to pull people to it, and people will naturally kind of gravitate towards that as an object.
I'm going to believe in the sort of ownership question that Holly White's, the woman moving the chair around, was about ownership. It's about her, this is my chair. For the time that I'm in it, it is my chair, and I want it in this place. And the moving thing is about expressing that ownership. And I think it's the same. You see people do this. They get on the bus and they put their bag on the chair next door. Isn't particularly to stop somebody from sitting. It's a comfortable place to put it. But actually, it's about, this is now my space. And maybe we need to work with that so that becomes a positive thing.
Mm.
So that people have a sense of responsibility, of a sense of ownership of the space, and therefore a sense of responsibility for it, that then self-maintain.
Yeah.
And I think that helps.
Yes, very true. I'm very, very aware that we're running over and it's getting late on a Friday. So I'll just put this last slide up to let you know what our plans are upcoming. But thank you both so much for your time, and thank you everybody who's joined us. I hope you agree it's been as fascinating as we feel it has been. If you'd like to review the previous sessions that we've done, we will be sharing, they're already on Vimeo, but we will be sharing them shortly along with this one as well, once we get that up. So do have a look there. We'll send out a link so that you can find those. And next month we are covering the sticky issue of value engineering in our sector. And yeah, we've mentioned positives today. We're determined to find some positives next month.
You must ask them about Larry Miles.
Oh, okay. We'll have you back, Nick. I'm sure you're encountering it on your project.
I refuse to allow that. They're not allowed to utter those words when I'm there.
Oh, yeah, but they'll find new ones. That's what
Yeah.
that's what we're hoping to find out. But particularly around its impact on sustainable procurement. So linking it back to SDG 12 there, responsible consumption and production. So I hope that many of you will join us for that. It's promising to be an interesting one again. And we'll be talking to Wayne Grills, who I think is maybe still with us. He's CEO at the British Association of Landscape Industries, and Alistair Bayford, who's also a landscape architect and operations director at ID Verdi UK, a large contractor here in the UK with a considerable presence. So prepare for some heated discussions. I'm sure that one will be an interesting one for all of us. And of course, we have a number of Vestra CPDs available ready that delve deeper into many of these topics that we're covering. And for instance, our Nordic Life in Urban Spaces one has had a section on Proxemics for about 4 years now in relation to our outdoor furniture. So we can explain more about benches if you'd like to hear that through Teams or Zoom. And thank you again, everybody, particularly Nick and Cannon, but also my colleagues, Matt and Jack. They're currently in the background, concealed, but helping with all of the functioning today. And Nick's cat's made an appearance again every time I speak to you. So on that note, thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks then. Bye.
Thanks very much, Romy. Cheers.
Okay. Bye for now.
See you. Cheers.
Yeah.